Imagine you're on a flight, laughing with friends, excited for the adventure ahead. Suddenly, the plane shudders violently. An ear-splitting roar fills the cabin as metal tears apart. The next thing you know, you're waking up in a frozen wasteland, surrounded by the wreckage of your plane and the bodies of your fellow passengers. This isn't a nightmare. This was the terrifying reality for the passengers of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 on October 13, 1972. A chartered plane carrying 45 people, including a university rugby team, their friends, and family, crashed high in the Andes Mountains. The initial impact and the freezing first night were devastating. Of the 45 on board, only 29 survived the first 24 hours. They were stranded at over 11,000 feet with no cold weather gear, no medical supplies, and barely any food. The survivors were mostly young men, athletes in peak physical condition. But the Andes are unforgiving. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero at night. They huddled together inside the broken fuselage for warmth, using seat cushions to block the gaping holes. They found a small transistor radio and listened intently for news of their rescue. Hope surged through them when they heard search planes were looking. But day after day, the planes flew overhead, unable to spot the white fuselage against the vast expanse of snow. Their meager food, supply a few chocolate bars, some crackers, and bottles of wind dwindled rapidly. Hunger became annoying, all-consuming pain. They tried eating the cotton from the airplane seats and even the leather from their shoes, but it was useless. As the days turned into a week, a horrifying realization began to dawn. The bodies of their deceased friends, preserved perfectly in the ice and snow, lay just outside the wreckage. This is where the story takes its most difficult and controversial turn. The survivors, many of whom were devout Catholics, were faced with an unthinkable choice: starve to death or do the unimaginable to survive. After agonizing debates and deep moral turmoil, they made a pact. If they were to live, they would have to consume the flesh of the dead. It was a decision born of sheer desperation, a pact made between souls clinging to life in the harshest environment on Earth. One of the survivors, Roberto Canessa, a medical student, was one of the first to take the grim step. Using a shot of glass, he performed the first cut. It was a moment that would haunt them forever, but it was also the moment they chose life over death. They justified their actions by comparing it to the Eucharist, believing they were taking the body and blood of their friends to sustain their own lives, with the hope of one day telling the world their story. Just as they had committed to this desperate act, a crushing blow came through the radio. After 10 days of searching, the official rescue effort was called off. The world had given them up for dead. Imagine the despair, the utter hopelessness of that moment. They were completely alone. The only people who could save them were themselves. But the Andes weren't finished with them yet. On the 17th day, while they slept in the cramped fuselage, a massive avalanche buried them completely. 8 more people were killed, trapping the remaining survivors under several feet of snow for 3 days. They were entombed in the dark, with dwindling oxygen, forced to lie next to the newly deceased. When they finally dug their way out, gasping for air, they emerged into a world that was even more desolate. The avalanche, however, had a grim silver lining. It provided them with a more insulated shelter from the biting cold. Weeks turned into months. The survivors established a routine. They assigned jobs. Some were butchers who prepared the food. Others melted snow into water, and others tended to the sick and injured. They were becoming a society, a tribe bound by a shared trauma and a singular goal: survival. But they knew they couldn't stay there forever. Spring was approaching, and the melting snow threatened to reveal the grim evidence of their survival. They had to find a way out. They knew Chile was to the west, but how far? The plane's co-pilot had insisted they had already flown past Curacao, a city in central Chile. This piece of misinformation would prove nearly fatal. Believing they were closer to civilization than they actually were, they organized several expeditions. The strongest among them, Nando, Parado, and Roberto Canessa, were chosen for the final, most desperate attempt. Parado was driven by an incredible will to live, having lost his mother and sister in the crash. Using insulation from the plane's tail section, they fashioned a makeshift sleeping bag After 60 days in the mountains, Parado and Canessa, along with a third member, Antonio Vicentin, set off. They had no mountaineering equipment, no maps, just the conviction that they had to keep moving west. Vicentin eventually had to turn back to conserve their meager food rations, leaving Parado and Canessa to continue alone. For 10 grueling days, they climbed mountains and navigated treacherous valleys. They were emaciated, weak, but utterly determined. They trekked for what felt like an eternity, their bodies screaming in protest. Finally, after climbing a massive peak and expecting to see the green valleys of Chile, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. More mountains, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a moment of pure despair. They had nearly given up. But then, a flicker of hope. In the distance, they saw a valley, and in that valley, a sign of life. A man on a horse. They were too weak to cross the raging river that separated them. They yelled, but their voices were lost in the roar of the water. The man, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, saw them but couldn't understand them. The next day, he returned. He tied a piece of paper and a pen to a rock and threw it across the river. On that piece of paper, Nando Parado wrote the words that would electrify the world. I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We have no food. We are weak. When are you going to come and fetch us? Please, we can't even walk. The rescue was finally set in motion. On December 22nd, 1972, after 72 days of unimaginable suffering, helicopters descended into the Valley of Tears. The world was stunned. The boys who had been declared dead were alive. The remaining 16 survivors were brought back to civilization. Their story of survival was hailed as a miracle. But when the truth of how they survived came out, public opinion shifted. They faced judgment and condemnation. It was only after a press conference where they tearfully explained the pact they had made, and with the support of the Catholic Church, that public perception began to soften. People started to understand that you cannot judge the actions of those who have been to the edge of human experience and back. The story of Flight 571 is more than just a survival tale. It's a profound story about the resilience of the human spirit, the moral complexities of survival, and the incredible power of hope and friendship in the face of utter despair. It forces us to ask ourselves, what would I do to survive? It's a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the will to live can conquer even